So today, we're going to explore the ins and outs of Tiana's Bayou adventure in Florida. Everything from the troubled lead up to the ride opening to the best way to experience the attraction now that it's open, and of course, what the ride is trying to communicate and what all of the show areas inside the ride mean in terms of message or experience. We'll also talk about how the Disneyland version in California is likely to be a slightly different experience than the recently opened attraction in Florida, and why all this matters. So today, we're going to dive into Tiana's Bayou adventure, and then next week, or at least that's the plan right now, we'll explore other news stories and recent changes to the American parks. We have a lot to discuss today, so if you're ready, let's go. Let's start with this. Overall, I enjoyed the ride. There are definitely pros and cons, and we'll talk about them, and also more interestingly, why there are issues at all. We'll also talk about what to look for, and generally, how this ride's design and execution stacks up against a fairly long history, or even an attraction philosophy of Disney dark rides of the past. But let's kick this off with the lead up to the attraction's grand opening. The new ride had a difficult set of previews, with the ride breaking down and passengers being evacuated many times as cast members, annual pass holders, DVC members, and so on were given early access to this attraction. At least one time, the fire alarm went off, causing the pre-recorded emergency evacuation spiel to be played throughout the building. Also, many of the animatronics are keyed to follow the logs as they pass, with the figures speaking directly to guests as they move by the scenes. This element, too, had issues during previews, probably with its sensors. Sometimes sensors never picked up a log's approach, so the animatronic never initiated their routine, and other times some of the audio was out of sync with the figure's movement. Yet other times figures moved, but their mouths didn't. Again, these problems happened in previews, which should be a period of test and adjust, but also these seemed like fairly sizable issues for an attraction that was scheduled to open later that same month. On June 22nd, Tiana's Bayou Adventure hosted its last set of previews, which was a paid hard ticket event for D23 Gold members. This was the first group of people who had specifically paid to experience the ride. If the ride went down for an extended period of time, there would likely be some refunds. But the ride opened early that night and remained operational for the entire event, which was a good sign. After the D23 event, the Florida crew had about a week without scheduled previews to work on and test the attraction. On June 25th, Rich Owens of Walt Disney Imagineering filed for a permit extension. Rich Owens is a contracts manager for WDI who's also worked on other large projects such as Cars Land and Cosmic Rewind. And this permit, which allows for work to continue, likely suggests that not everything is complete on the ride just yet. During previews a few years back, not everything was complete on Cosmic Rewind either. My guess is that this is the result of upper management trying to shorten the construction and installation time on Disney property, especially as everyone can easily see how quickly Universal is able to finish projects, even full parks just across town. But this is also the downside of that faster timeline, extensions to fully complete the attraction after it opens. I was in Orlando and walked through the park a few times the week before the ride opened. At the start of the week, logs were being cycled through the attraction, but then on Wednesday, just 2 days before the grand opening, the ride was drained with the million-ish gallons of water being moved to the backstage holding tank, which likely wasn't a good sign. This indicated that more work or fixes were being done inside of the show building. On the next day, Thursday, the logs were again back in the flume being cycled through the track course, though without any passengers. But there were no soft openings for guests that week, even during the extended evening hours which were arranged for deluxe resort guests, which probably meant that the crew was working as quickly as they could to make sure that the attraction would be in the best possible shape for opening day. All signs on opening day suggested managers expected trouble. There are presently two ways to ride Tiana's Bayou adventure, through the virtual queue or through a regular Genie Plus reservation. Both options opened on Friday morning at 7 a.m. and were completely sold out within about 15 or 20 seconds. This is not uncommon for a new attraction on opening day. I was lucky enough to get a spot on Genie Plus. The ride opened on time and appeared to be operating smoothly. But what was interesting was that around 9 in the morning, Disney released another bucket of reservation spots for the attraction on Genie Plus. And this seemed to happen again throughout the day. And these were likely reservation spots that initially had been held back in case the ride had operational issues. For clarity, the virtual queue only happens at 7 a.m. and 1 p.m. But reservation spot for Genie Plus can be added or refilled at any point during the day with no previous announcement. So if you're interested in riding this attraction in the next 2 or 3 weeks, Genie Plus is your best bet. And if you don't get a reservation spot at the 7 a.m. drop, check back into Genie Plus often. And yes, I know this means a lot of walk-around screen time, but that option is there if you want to use it. For the rest of the first day, the ride operated somewhat amazingly smoothly with no downtime. When I was on it that day, all of the animatronics operated exactly as they should. We'll talk about that experience in a moment, but the wave of good luck that Disney enjoyed on opening day ended on day 2, when the ride did not open with the park. In fact, it wasn't admitting guests until hours after the park opened. And then the following day, the ride was down again for hours. In terms of a review, I'm going to try to focus on what's there, what's working, what needs work, and why, as opposed to jumping into larger areas of discourse right now. That is, I'll focus on the creation, presentation, and execution of the ride, along with 1 or 2 related stories, but even within these parameters, there's a lot here to explore. As others have pointed out, there are gaps in the show elements on the ride in Florida, which speaks to its visual pacing. Generally, there are empty spaces along the flume, and then there are show scenes filled with animatronics, and then more empty space. I think this is more of an issue in terms of watching the ride with a point of view online video than in riding it in person. But I do have a theory as to why there are so many gaps. 30 or so years ago, Disney first built Splash Mountain in California, which opened in 1989. And then 3 years later, opened a different version of this ride in Florida. As opposed to other attractions where the experience is nearly identical on both coasts, such as with Rise of the Resistance, Smuggler's Run, Soaring, Ariel's Undersea Adventure, and so on, there are some significant differences between the 2 Splash Mountain attractions in America. The Disneyland version is 2.5 minutes shorter than the Florida version. The Disneyland Flume course also has a different number and arrangement of lifts and drops, and logs on the Disneyland version generally move a lot faster than those in Florida. The Tiana redo for this attraction, however, was done for both attractions at the same time. And here's my theory. I'm guessing that all the show scenes and animatronics are going to be identical on both coasts. The photos that I've seen of the Disneyland animatronics are a perfect match for what's already in Florida. But at Disneyland, those show scenes, which are arranged into a 9-minute ride, will feel a bit fuller as opposed to the version in Florida, where those same scenes are arranged into a nearly 12-minute experience. The extra time on the ride, and also that the logs generally move much slower in Florida, clearly highlight the gaps between the show elements. I won't jump into this topic too deeply here, as it's more of a discussion about Splash Mountain than Tiana's Bayou Adventure. But water flow dynamics was one of the large issues that Walt Disney Imagineering struggled with as it assembled Splash Mountain in California, which was its first log flume ride at any Disney park. Disney had created water-propelled rides such as Small World and Pirates, but on these rides, at least for most of the experience, the water moved at a uniform speed. The issues with Splash Mountain had to do with how to transition sections where water moved faster with sections where the water moved slower, which continually happened throughout the California version of the ride, essentially adding and removing speed in a ride where propulsion was arranged by the movement of water. Eventually, to open the ride in California, Disney called in outside consultants to adjust and finalize the ride long after construction had started. One of the solutions for this problem in Florida was to have an overall slower current, with fewer shifts between fast and slow flow areas. To put this simply, the original Splash Mountain in California has more thrill areas where guests move quickly along the flume, whereas Splash Mountain in Florida was arranged more as a water dark ride, with one large thrill at the end. To be honest, I liked the Florida version a little more than the one in California, as the slower experience allowed for a situation where the story elements in Splash Mountain could be better developed. It also gave guests more time to see those show areas. But the slower water flow rate in Florida now creates a situation where it feels like there's more of a gap between show sets. I'm assuming that we're going to have the exact same water flow speeds in California when this ride reopens, so the gaps there will feel less noticeable. But beyond this, the online videos don't fully represent the attraction. Part of any log ride, especially one with various lifts and drops, is fully experienced in the body, not just with the eyes and ears. And this is one of those aspects that's simply not conveyed well in any online video. So if you're judging this attraction based only on those online videos, I think you might want to keep in mind that some key aspects of enjoyment in this ride come from you in your body moving through real space. And this brings up the issue of story, which is an area that often confuses me in terms of Disney attractions. Specifically now, the story elements that are inside Tiana's Bayou adventure. Western literary tradition has a very specific idea as to what a story or a narrative is. Specifically, a story is a unique set of experiences that presents protagonists with conflict and tension and typically moves them towards a culminating moment where they overcome or are at least changed by those challenges, troubles, or struggles. Walt himself was very interested in engaging this type of story arrangement in his animated features. Snow White, Pinocchio, Dumbo, and so on all have rising tension that moves protagonists into a unique narrative space, and Walt, conversely, was not very interested in using Disneyland attractions to convey this type of story. Generally, I think that Walt was very smart about this. Narrative and entertainment forms have different emphasis areas. That is, different narrative and entertainment forms, based on their strengths, have messages that they find it more convenient to communicate. For example, a novel, because of its length, is a strong form to communicate a story. Moreover, because of how language is used in novels, typically placing readers within the thought perspective of a central character, novels are particularly good at conveying stories in such a way that readers feel a deep connection with the central character. Likewise, films, also because of their length, are a strong form to communicate story, but because they are a visual format, they are often far better at conveying dramatic tension than novels. A car chase in a movie, for example, can easily be an exciting set piece on screen, as this type of dramatic tension is something that visual forms like film find it convenient to communicate, whereas a car chase in a novel is a far more difficult trick to pull off, as the story focus of a novel tends to be centered on how one or more characters experience the events. Poems, commercials, and short cartoons, because of their brevity, all aren't very good at conveying complex narratives. All of these can convey limited stories, but if you look over the history of, let's say cartoons, you'll quickly see that often their large appeal is tied to either the pleasures that viewers experience while watching drawings move in interesting ways with music, or from visual comedy, often slapstick. That is, short literary and visual forms don't find it very convenient to communicate complex stories. Now let's shift over to dark rides at a theme park. In 1955, none of the original dark rides in Walt Disney's Fantasyland communicated a story. They reminded readers of a story they saw in a movie, but they didn't tell that story in a way that was understandable in the ride itself. So writers on Peter Pan's flight might be reminded of the story they saw in the movie, and then on the ride they re-experience some of those narrative moments based on what they recalled from the film. But if you just put someone on that same ride who has never seen the movie, nor the play, nor read the novel, then ask them based on the ride what the story of Peter Pan was, I doubt they'd be able to tell you much at all. Simply, theme park dark rides aren't the strongest form of communicating stories, and Walt understood this. As Disneyland rides became more sophisticated in the 1960s, Walt didn't look to them as the means of communicating a unified story, but rather as a means of communicating mood, environment, engaging dramatic set pieces, and moments of visual wonder, often underscored by music. In the original version of Pirates of the Caribbean, long before Johnny Depp was airdropped into that attraction, there's no strong story being told on that ride. Rather, Pirates is a series of unique environments and set pieces. For most of the ride, even right now, you float by scenes of a city just after it has been captured by pirates. According to legendary Imagineer Ex Atencio, Walt Disney thought of Pirates of the Caribbean as a type of cocktail party, albeit a disturbing one, in which guests floated past unique gatherings and interesting conversations. It's like a cocktail party, Walt told Ex Atencio. People come to cocktail parties. They'll tune in a conversation over here, tune in one over there, and next time they go through, they'll hear something else. That'll bring them back again and again. And that's an interesting way to think about what a dark ride can offer. The Haunted Mansion, likewise, at least in its original form, didn't offer much of a story either, so much as a series of engaging environments and interesting set pieces where we mostly watch ghosts frolic once they come out to play in either the ballroom or the graveyard. I should point out that there are some dark rides that actually tell a story in the ride itself, but these attractions tend to have two unique attributes. First, these storytelling rides tend to be fairly long, as stories take time to develop. And second, they tend to rely on familiar characters and familiar story archetypes, as this is the quickest way to create a story in a ride environment. Rise of the Resistance over in Galaxy's Edge is a great example of how this works. First, with all of its segments put together, it's almost a 20-minute dark ride experience, so there's length there to create a story. And second, Rise of the Resistance uses familiar characters such as Rey and Kylo Ren who don't need to be explained to the audience. And lastly, this attraction also uses a very familiar story archetype from the Star Wars films. Is the story of Rise of the Resistance unique to the ride? Well, yes, it is technically a new story, but the framework for that story is one that Star Wars fans have seen on screen in books and in comic books over and over and over for years. Members of the rebellion are captured by either the Empire or the First Order and now need to escape. And that's the narrative of Rise of the Resistance as well. So if you look at Rise of the Resistance, there's an actual story there. Stories typically begin when a protagonist is pushed out of their comfort zone and forced to confront a new experience. And these elements are certainly included at the beginning of Rise of the Resistance. You, as the protagonist here, are forced to evacuate from Batu. Next, stories have complications that increase the initial tension, and this happens on Rise of the Resistance as well. While on your evacuation ship, you are captured by the First Order and taken in for interrogation. Next, stories typically have further complications. Again, after being interrogated on this ride, you are asked to participate in a risky plan to escape from the First Order ship. And lastly, stories in general typically conclude when the danger is overcome or a goal is reached. And here on Rise of the Resistance, this happens as well, when you escape the First Order ship and return to Lieutenant Beck. Rise of the Resistance is reasonably effective at telling a story, but also, in terms of this, it's very much an outlier in Disney attractions. And it's successful because of its unique length, and because it's presenting familiar characters, and in terms of the Star Wars universe, also a familiar archetypal story as well. So I'm always confused why new Disney attractions, often at the urging of the Disney company itself, are examined from the perspective of narrative. Telling complex narrative stories is simply not something that dark rides do very easily or even particularly well. Films, TV shows, novels, and plays are all far better mediums to convey an engaging story. But immersion into a unique environment, the exploration of an unusual situation, and the presentation of immediately engaging characters are areas that dark rides tend to do better than other narrative-focused and narrative-adjacent forms, such as novels or even movies. So maybe on the positive side, Tiana's Bayou adventure doesn't recreate scenes from the movie, in the fashion of rides based on Peter Pan and The Little Mermaid, which are sometimes called book report rides. This ride wants to do something original with familiar characters. I would say that generally this is a plus, though I will also point out that the recently opened book report attractions at Fantasy Springs in Tokyo are pretty amazing. But to get back to Tiana's Bayou adventure in Florida, the characters in the ride are older than their counterparts in the movie, and the drama takes place a while after the movie ends. I would also lay some money here that some of the elements in Tiana's Bayou adventure would have seemed more familiar if the Disney Plus TV series Tiana had premiered as planned in 2023. That is, development for that Disney Plus limited series about Tiana, which was arranged as a sequel of sorts for Princess and the Frog, was in development at the exact same time as the ride Tiana's Bayou Adventure was announced. There was the announcement for that Tiana's miniseries in 2021 with artwork, which means that the series had been in production for a while. Tiana's Bayou Adventure was originally announced in June 2020, and it seems inconceivable, especially at Disney, which deeply values synergy, that these two projects would not be in communication with each other. So elements of this new ride, which would include scenes, narrative beats, and character situations, might have seemed more familiar if that Tiana miniseries had premiered before the ride, thereby setting up and adding some gravitas to the stages inside the ride. Or, to put it this way, when you're writing Peter Pan's Flight, does the journey above London seem wondrous because you're above a model city constructed at scale? Or does it seem wondrous because, while on the ride, you're reenacting an experience from a beloved film? So it's that second area, the sense of being familiar with specific situations, that might have given the ride more power if the proposed Tiana's series had been released before the attraction opened. But to get back to the center of this section, is there an actual story in Tiana's Bayou Adventure? Well, not really, There's a very basic narrative setup. Tiana needs musicians to play at the Mardi Gras celebration that she's hosting, but in terms of this goal, there's no meaningful complication, escalation of tension, or conflict. The desire to find musicians for a party is just the basic premise for the ride. Sure, this could be more complex and nuanced, and perhaps even a little more original, but generally I would say that this shouldn't be an issue at all for a dark ride. What matters in all this, at least from my perspective, is how well this premise leads us into interesting environments, unique experiences, or to compelling set pieces. And here are some pros and cons of the newly opened ride. The two strongest aspects of the ride are the Bayou environment and the music. This ride, hands down, has some of the luscious, loveliest environments to float through. The outdoor sections with the cypress trees, vines, and various plants are stunning. The lushness of this world isn't just in the outdoor sections, but is also included in many interior showrooms as well. Decades ago, for a never-built Disney park in St. Louis, Walt's team imagined a ride in which guests would simply move through a recreation of a Louisiana bayou. After this park project was abandoned, some of those ideas were incorporated into the Disneyland version of Pirates of the Caribbean. And now something similar is here in Tiana's Bayou Adventure. But this approach of environmental exploration is generally a strength area of the dark ride. That is, this is the type of experience that is convenient and effective for a dark ride to convey. In many ways, a lovely environment can be the centerpiece of a very satisfying dark ride experience. For example, when you visit Yosemite or the Grand Canyon, are you primarily looking for a story? Or are the beautiful surroundings more than enough to satisfy you? It's probably the second one, right? And Tiana's Bayou Adventure has this aspect of a dark ride fully realized and then some. The second aspect that works very well and continuously throughout the ride is the music. The vast majority of highly successful Disney dark rides are artistically arranged around song. From Small World to Pirates to the original Journey into Imagination to the Mansion to Runaway Railway, the energy of music combined with visuals is another area that dark rides often communicate better than books, films, video games, plays, and so on. But this leads me to some areas where the results in Tiana's Bayou Adventure are a little more mixed. Let's start with the animatronics. The technology of these new animatronics is in itself stunning. The best ones, in terms of mechanics and presentations, are on the same level as the shaman in Navi River Journey. But here's the problem. Those impressive figures aren't communicating important messages, nor are they creating engaging narrative moments. So the element that draws me to these figures is their lifelike presentation and the fluidity of their movements. That is, I'm impressed with the technology, and in many ways, I could just watch that for hours. But on the other hand, unlike the animatronics in Rise of the Resistance or Pirates, for example, these impressive figures here in the Bayou aren't creating dramatic moments that are engaging me deeply in the experience. Many of the animal characters in Tiana's Bayou Adventure are visually inviting, or to put that another way, their cuteness is eye-catching, which is a plus. Their visual presentation also presents unique personalities, which is another plus. But mostly what happens in the ride is that we are presented with one band after another of pleasing animal musicians, and then Tiana announces, as our log floats by, that these musicians are all very good, or to put it in the phrasing of the ride, they're the bee's knees, and should be invited to her party. This creates repetition in the ride, but also a type of repetition that isn't immediately engaging. Other Disney rides better nail down this aspect of immediate dramatic engagement. I find it far more engaging to watch a pirate set up an auction in a town that has just been ransacked, or in watching Leota's head float in a crystal ball as she calls out to spirits who communicate back to her with taps and bells. Both of those show stages have more visual intrigue in their dramatic elements than the stages in Tiana's Bayou Adventure. But also let me add that Tiana's Bayou Adventure is clearly pitched to a younger audience than Pirates or The Mansion, so that may be part of the overt calculations here, to create a very simple, non-threatening ride for families with younger children. Relatedly, I think that Tiana's Bayou Adventure also misses an opportunity to build anticipation and suspense by layering the ride up that final long lift hill with darker music and show stages that announce the coming danger of the drop. But again, part of the redo of Splash Mountain clearly seems to make the new ride more inviting and comfortable for younger children. So without that tense buildup, the final 50-foot drop is far less scary than it was in Splash Mountain. What makes a drop scary is not so much the drop itself, but the dread that builds up as you move toward it. Again, this may be part of the very conscious calculus here, to refocus the ride so that it's more comfortable for young kids, even if that means it's now slightly less engaging for adults who I'm pretty sure would find the drop more memorable if there were a darker, more threatening build-up to it as they are slowly drawn up that lift hill toward the drop. But again, that's likely a conscious choice, that younger kids are made more comfortable, but at the expense of arranging a final thrill experience on the drop that would be more engaging and memorable for teens and adults. I suppose no review of Tiana's Bayou Adventure would be complete without a mention of, for lack of a better name, what I will call the Mushroom and Giant Frog Caverns. At a certain point in the ride, guests are shrunk down to the size of frogs, kind of like in the movie, and then guests float through a showroom that feels like a visual departure from the movie entirely, with giant CGI images of Mama Odie and Tiana appearing on screens. There's little explanation in the ride itself for why guests are shrunk down to the size of frogs, other than Mama Odie saying it's time to think big. For theme park old-timers, this part of the ride feels a lot like the designs for the original Knott's Berry Tales out in California, with a certain 1960s pop art influence. I think that this may actually be the most lasting part of the ride, as it's the most original. It's also the only place where it wasn't immediately obvious what was happening and what was being conveyed. That is, this was the only part of the ride that asked guests to focus a little more on what was being communicated, therefore creating a slightly deeper type of engagement through this section. And then on the final lift hill, right after the Frog Caverns, Mama Odie says that she's now going to return everyone back to their regular size. And again, this just seems to be a whimsical departure from more familiar moments in the attraction. The transition from the caverns to the final long lift is smooth. The final lift hill is paired with the very upbeat song Dig a Little Deeper, as opposed to the dark tense tones used at this point in the ride on Splash Mountain, which makes the move to the final drop, as I mentioned, a whole lot more child-friendly, as the drop now is a fun shortcut to Tiana's party, rather than a potentially troubling experience of being tossed off Chickapin Hill. In terms of indoor spaces, the final show stage, which presents Tiana singing a new song called Special Spice, which was written for this ride, has one of the best programmed and animated animatronic figures anywhere at the Florida Resort. This is an A1000 animatronic whose mechanic, range of movement, and facial presentations are similar to other A1000s at Disney World, such as Hondo at Smuggler's Run or the Shaman at Navi River Journey. In terms of the history of Disney World, the original animatronic figures at the park when it opened back in 1971 were largely A1 hydraulic figures such as Abraham Lincoln. In 1989, Disney premiered the next generation of what they called A100 figures with the Wicked Witch of the West in the Great Movie Ride, which at the time was the most complex figure anywhere at the resort. And then with Pandora and Galaxy's Edge, Disney premiered A1000 electronic figures, which not only had a greater range of movement, but also were capable of more precise and nuanced expressions. In the final show area here at Tiana's Bayou Adventure, Tiana's movements as an A1000 figure are complex and fluid as she dances while singing. Tiana is also surrounded by other less sophisticated figures, but this final arrangement here works beautifully as the focus is mostly on Tiana's dance. This is one of the strongest, most flowing exhibitions of animatronic work anywhere in the U.S. The final showroom also fixes some of the maintenance problems that plagued Splash Mountain with its rocking steamboat finale. The steamboat, which was lovely, was a moving stage that pivoted back and forth while presenting animatronics who were also moving. This particular show scene from Splash was difficult to maintain and was often broken. The new finale has all the animatronics arranged on a flat, non-moving stage, which hopefully means that they will have longer periods of uptime. In terms of story elements in the attraction, I'm pretty sure that if I don't mention this now, some listeners will email me to explain that there are articles and letters posted in the queue that help create a richer backstory for Tiana, particularly her relationship with her father James and the evolution of her business, and that is entirely true. There are some very nice touches in the indoor queue area that honor veterans and explore life in a military family. Also, when we move to text, such as articles and letters, we're moving to a narrative form that finds storytelling far more convenient than a dark ride. That means it's easier for a letter to present more nuanced aspects of storytelling than a dark ride. I'd wager that most people learn more about Tiana by reading a handful of letters in the queue than they do in the ride itself. And so if you have time, you should read those elements as you move through the queue. But also, character backstories arranged in the queue are engaged by only a few guests, and likely not on their first visit to this ride, as the line here moves fairly quickly past the places where these letters and articles are posted. Or to put this another way, letters and articles on a wall will be read by a small percent, perhaps not even 1% of guests, and therefore aren't really part of the common ride experience. In contrast, I'd say that the pre-ride hologram-like appearance of Rey and Rise of the Resistance is experienced and watched by nearly all who go on the attraction, and therefore Rey's appearance and message is part of the common attraction experience for those who go on the ride. But here, those literary elements that dress the walls of Tiana's queue are mostly experienced by deep fans, and probably not on their first trip, who are now trying to connect better with or understand the experience a little bit more. Also, many of those elements in the queue, particularly about Tiana's father, don't directly set up any show or story elements of the ride itself, whereas Rey's message over in Rise of the Resistance explains the exact terms of the actual attraction, so there's far more of a deep connection there. Maybe the materials in Tiana's queue help us better understand Tiana's background, but they don't play strongly into show scenes, where Tiana later is largely looking for bands of musical animals for a Mardi Gras party she wants to host, scenes that have little to do with her father or with building a business. I should point out that in the queue area here is also one of the metaphoric leave-behinds that Imagineers tend to create when a new ride takes over an existing attraction space. Basically, Imagineers try to leave call-outs to the former attraction. In Tiana's office, as you move through the queue, you'll find above the typewriter elements that represent the old Splash Mountain. These are small. They look to be mostly ceramic figurines of a rabbit, fox, bear, and frog, which were some of the main characters of Splash Mountain, along with that steamboat, which was the centerpiece of that ride's final scene. The fox figurine is much smaller than the others, so you may have to squint a little to see him. But here they are, pointers to Splash Mountain hidden inside of Tiana's Bayou Adventure. Also, I should point out that most of these elements are on display in the line area used by the virtual queue, what will eventually become the standby line, not in the Lightning Lane queue. The Lightning Lane queue, which is shorter, bypasses some of these areas or only allows you to see them from a distance. The trade-off here is that the Lightning Lane is quicker, but you'll miss some displays in the longer queue area. Overall, Tiana's Bayou Adventure is a very enjoyable experience. It's nowhere near as complex as, say, Rise of the Resistance, nor is it as unified and polished a ride experience as Runaway Railway. But it is an engaging, if not perfect, attraction, particularly in regards to the absolutely outdoor bayou elements, some beautifully dressed indoor stage areas, that crazy mushroom and giant frog cavern, the stellar music throughout the ride, and the presentation of some sophisticated animatronics. It's the music, particularly its upbeat energy, that easily makes this a repeatable experience. Tiana's Bayou Adventure also transforms the previous attraction that mostly was pitched for tweens and teens into a ride whose elements are more pitched towards kids. The height minimum for riders is 40 inches, which in theme park jargon means the average 4-year-old. I think the drop might be a bit much for some 4-year-olds, but to me feels fine for kids slightly older. Or to put this another way, you might think twice about taking certain 6 or 7-year-olds on Haunted Mansion, but Tiana's Bayou Adventure feels right for this age group. Many recent Magic Kingdom editions have been arranged for the tween and teen demographic, such as the Tron Coaster and Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, but the reconfiguration of Splash Mountain creates a new thrill ride that is far more family-focused. Presently, there are only 2 ways to experience this attraction. You can join the virtual queue at 7 a.m. from your hotel, or at 1 p.m. after you enter the park. Remember, to be eligible for the 1 p.m. virtual queue, you need to be inside of the Magic Kingdom. So long as you have a ticket to the Magic Kingdom, there's no additional charge for the virtual queue. The virtual queue is also the option that will take you through the full queue area as well. Also starting at 7 a.m. presently, you can join the Genie Plus Lightning Lane. I think you have better odds of joining the Lightning Lane than the virtual queue, but also there's a cost for the Genie Plus service. But if recent history is prologue, Disney appears to be replenishing reservation spots in Genie Plus sporadically throughout the day, so long as the ride is working, which certainly hasn't been the case every day so far. So if you don't get a 7 a.m. spot in Genie Plus, you can reload that screen on your smartphone many times during the day until you do find a spot. But overall, I think the odds of you finding a space eventually on Genie Plus are better than you finding a space in the virtual queue, particularly on busy days. One last thing, remember, on July 24th, Disney will shift from Genie Plus to Lightning Lane Multipass, which has a different timeline for reserving spots on Tiana's Bayou Adventure. So if you're visiting on or after July 24th, make sure to listen to our episode on Lightning Lane 2.0, which explains all your options within this new ride reservation system. Okay, so now hopefully you should be fully set up to engage Tiana's Bayou Adventure when you visit the park, and hopefully today's episode gives you a few things to notice when you're in the queue and on the ride, and some new ways to think about and enjoy the ride experience as it unfolds around you. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan, at least right now, is to have our usual monthly omnibus episode in which we look at news stories about the Disney company and talk about new experiences at the parks. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.